The Gills Creek Watershed has been part of South Carolina's landscape even before there was an official South Carolina. Prior to the settlement of the Europeans, several Native American tribes inhabited the area. As seen on this map, the Wateree, Catawba, and Congaree tribes lived on the land we now recognize as the Gills Creek Watershed. Once the Europeans ventured across the Atlantic Ocean and made their way to the New World, these tribes began having their first of many encounters with the settlers. Initially, the relationship between the tribe members and settlers was mutually beneficial. They traded goods with each other, and the Native Americans provided insight on how to best utilize the land. The rivers and creeks remained vital for transportation between tribal villages and colonial settlements, as did the road system. Camden Road, referenced on several land plats that will be seen later, originated from a Native American path that later became a wagon road for settlers. Unfortunately, peace between colonists and tribes would not last. The colonists began to expand their settlements, many times onto Native American land. Then, war broke out between the two. Wars, along with diseases brought by the Europeans, wiped out a large number of Native Americans. Some descendants of these tribe members remain in the area to this day. Once colonists began taking ownership of the land, the state was divided into 4 districts. The Gills Creek Watershed was part of Craven County until the late 1780s, when South Carolina began forming the districts we recognize now. From this point on, it is easy to see how the land changes into what we know today. Beginning with the northern, well-known area of the Gills Creek Watershed, Sesquicentennial State Park provides fun and entertainment for fellow South Carolinians and visitors. The family-friendly atmosphere has a unique history, like the rest of the watershed, so let's take another trip back in time. Here you see a portion of Jackson Creek that runs through Sesquicentennial State Park and was named after landowners Richard and Philip Jackson, who came to the area in the 1740s. As a cultural resource survey researched by University of South Carolina graduate students, Sesquicentennial State Park, like much of the watershed, is a vanished landscape of slavery. Its former fields, fences, slave houses, grist and sawmills, roads, and pine woods tell stories about the lived experience of African Americans, and the other who inhabited the pre-park site. Continuing into the 20th century, Sesquicentennial State Park was one of 16 state parks to utilize the Civilian Conservation Corps, enacted by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933, to provide jobs to men and address neglected landscapes. These men, some of whom are pictured here, worked tirelessly to help construct the park we enjoy today. Please enjoy some historic photos of how the park and its waters have been utilized since the CCC revamped it into an enjoyable place of leisure. This is a view of the swimming area from 1956. This photograph from the same year highlights the playfulness of the swimming area. While so many white families were able to enjoy the activities Sesquicentennial had to offer, blacks were not. Here is a letter of denied admittance to the park signed by several African American community members. Plans to create a separate park for blacks were discussed. However, once the civil rights movement began to affect South Carolina, blacks were admitted to the park, and the plans to create a separate park for them never came to fruition. Almost 20 years later, people still crowded the grassy banks and flowing water of Sesquicentennial's swimming area. Journeying south into the middle area of the watershed, let's venture into the area we now know as Forest Lake, one of the many plots of land purchased by Thomas Taylor in 1784. It leaves a lasting imprint on the area, as artifacts from his ownership still remain. The ruins seen here are the old Thomas Taylor Mill, which began operating in 1796. This remains one of the few pieces of evidence of enslaved labor throughout the area prior to the Civil War. Taylor used this mill for weaving cotton for personal use until it was purchased by John and Edward Fisher, who established it as one of the first spinning mills in the county. Enslaved labor was utilized in the building of the mill and also in the work of the mill. These ruins sit along Gills Creek just below the current Forest Lake area. Prior to the renaming and expansion of the area, this lake was known as Dent's Pond. Samuel Dent dammed Gills Creek north of Camden Road to power a sawmill, creating the lake. This photograph of locals standing on a wooden bridge over the lake is from 1907. This area saw a large number of changes throughout its time. This is a still from 1912 of the dam creating Dent's Pond and the swimming area under the dam. In this same year, Dent's Pond was purchased by the Lakeview Investment Company, and the dam was reinforced with concrete to what is seen here and what it resembles today. By 1955, a Forest Lake Country Club had been established. Here we see many swimmers enjoying the pool that had a lakefront view. Please enjoy a history of this area told by local librarian Margaret Dunlap, a granddaughter of one of the Coopers and an influential family who lived and worked as developers.
The lake behind me was originally called Dent's Pond, and it was the Dent family that lived here and built the dam here on Gills Creek during the antebellum period. The Dents operated a mill. They operated a sawmill. They also made turpentine from all the pine trees around here, and they were a very successful family. And they lived here for generations. And around the turn of the century, around 1912, the Dent family sold their property to some developers from Columbia who wanted to make a recreation area out here. And around that time, around 1912, a group of developers from Columbia bought the lake and the property. They improved the lake and the dam and made the lake deeper, and it became known as Forest Lake. That was a recreation area for the people of Columbia. They would come out about 5 miles from Columbia to swim. And then my family actually got involved around 1922. My grandfather's uncle, John Hughes Cooper, bought the property from those developers and increased the size of the lake, also improved the dam and built a pavilion right here. And it was a dance hall and a country club, and there was a swimming pool down there below the dam, and that was called Lakeview Club. And Lakeview Club was like a membership club, and people would come out and fish and swim, and it was a pretty popular spot, and that's where some of these artifacts that I have probably came from. Lakeview was a place for people to dance and drink, and so in the area below me, some artifacts like this old beer can that was never opened and washed up, and also these very sort of 1922 era swimming goggles.
The Forest Lake region, suitably named Forest Acres, has not only seen a large increase in residential development, but also in the urbanization of the land. This sign from Mr. Donut from 1969 is only one example of the ever-involving businesses that came to the area. Please listen to local biologist and naturalist John Seeley describe the changes in this part of the watershed's urban landscape.
Crum Plaza at that time was a broom sedge field. And broom straw, it was just a big field with a creek running through the middle of it. They built the shopping center, I think, in the late 50s. Maybe 3 years after we moved out here. But this was our Mississippi River, so to speak. This was our, kids are attracted to water like a magnet. If there's water within a half a mile, kids will find it. The biggest change, of course, has been urban development. They built the shopping center in the late 50s, and then, you know, they built around the edge of the creek. When we were fishing, especially, we'd walk up to the base of Forest Lake Dam and fish below the dam from the stretch there down to Forest Drive. It was, you know, the land belonged to somebody, but it was not developed. So it was kind of a free range, so to speak, free range for kids and fishermen. They were always fishermen up there. So starting, I guess, maybe in the mid-late 60s and 70s, they started building right up to the edge of the creek. You couldn't do that now. You'd be walking in somebody's backyard. So it's basically the access to the creek here is pretty much, very much more restricted than when we were growing up. The creek itself looks pretty much the same. It's always been shallow like this. One issue of any watershed, an urban watershed, is of course the sedimentation and the runoff. And when you hardscape all the watershed, when you don't leave buffers along the creek bank, all that sediment just runs into the creek. And but it was shallow like this when we were kids. Now, historically, in the 1800s, this creek was a blackwater stream, like the Edisto River, the little PD. It's got more sedimentation in it now, so it's not that jet black black water that we associate with coastal streams and rivers.
Not far from this area of Gills Creek Watershed, displaced blacks began to settle in communities. One of the communities is called Frogtown. Remnants of a brick wall constructed around the area during segregation still stands, providing evidence of the original community created during the early 20th century. Another community that became a haven for African Americans during post-Reconstruction was Arthurtown. Many of the first families still reside in the area. While most of the original houses have been replaced with newer homes in recent years, these communities provide crucial context to the more modern African American history of the watershed, as their daily use of the creeks provides a more comprehensive history. Moving just slightly south from Forest Lake, the land deed we see here, purchased by Thomas Harwell in 1784, would be used for plantation land growing a variety of crops until after the Civil War. It was later become the western half of Lake Catherine, a thriving and large part of today's watershed. This land plat, owned by Peter Smith, was seen referenced on the previous land plat. This 100-acre plot of land would also become part of the Lake Catherine area following the Civil War. This 640-acre lot, purchased jointly by Peter Furnau and Francis Bremer in 1784, was used similarly to the previous two plots of land. Each of these planters used the land to grow cotton, tobacco, and produce to sustain their families and livelihoods. This area would later become the eastern half of Lake Catherine, completing the southernmost, largest body of water in the Gills Creek Watershed. Shortly before the area became the watershed's largest body of water, Bowers Beach was created in 1920 as another source of entertainment for the city residents. For the first 3 years of the beach's existence, a trolley service would bring swimmers to the facility. Over the next few decades, this segment of the watershed would witness several drastic changes in efforts to utilize the water. The U.S. Army also saw the benefits of the watershed's features had to offer. In 1917, a large portion of land belonging to Wade Hampton's estate and additional land within the watershed was sold to allow for the construction of Camp Jackson, now known as Fort Jackson. Portions of the creek were drained and channelized in the construction. In 1940, 20 years before this aerial photograph was taken, the Army dammed a southern portion of Forest Lake as a source of drinking water for troops. Once the Army's lease ended, this land reverted to Burrow Manning, who named the lake for his mother, Catherine. This photograph from 1958 provides a more modern look at the area. Residents and curious onlookers survey the damage done during a dam break on the lake. Here is a view of the land today. Houses line both portions of the lake known as Lake Catherine and Little Lake Catherine. This drive shows Little Lake Catherine's side of the lakes. In summer, you can see many families on the land enjoying what this part of the watershed has to offer. Now that you have gotten a brief history of the larger area of Gills Creek Watershed, keep in mind you can see branches of Gills Creek and its connecting rivers throughout all of Columbia. And please stay tuned for our second video It highlights the personal experiences of current and past residents of the watershed.